Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, November 6th, 2023. And on Friday's episode, I gave an overview of what I saw as Alexander Hamilton's craziest plan, his plan of government that he proposed in a day-long speech, June 18, 1787, during the Philadelphia Convention. I thought this was, I look at this one as the most insane of all of his insane big government ideas. Now, he may not have gotten the exact system that he wanted on paper, but in a number of major ways. Some of it and how things have been twisted by the people, some of it by the government themselves. We got the same, if not worse. And so today I'm going to share with you 3 ways he got what he wanted. And as a result, we live under the largest government in history. And then there's one that he didn't get. Now, first of all, it's important to point out, again, that his plan of government, I think really, if you read through it and you understand the big picture of his whole speech that he gave, this day-long speech, is that his goal really was unlimited central power. Unlimited power in, you could call it a federal government, I guess, but a central or general government that could legislate in all cases whatsoever. And that was the first point of his 11-point plan, the supreme legislative power with power to pass all laws whatsoever. So a central government of Congress and the Senate that could pass whatever they want in whatever situation. The states couldn't do anything to the contrary. And in fact, he really wanted the states to be part of that general government. He wanted to get rid of the states, but you can check out Friday's episode if you want more detail on that. Now, this is an eerie reminder for anyone who's studied this of the Declaratory Act of 1766, which really is, if you think about it, the basis of the American Revolution. And in the Declaratory Act, Parliament, the king and Parliament, final authority, full sovereignty in government itself, claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Thomas Paine described it like this in a 1792 letter. He said, "If then the Stamp Act was a usurpation of the Americans' most precious and sacred rights, the Declaratory Act left them no rights at all, and contained the full-grown seeds of the most despotic government ever exercised in the world." Any government that claims power over people or parts of its structure in any situation, claiming power in all cases whatsoever, this is the most despotic government that could exist in any time, according to Thomas Paine. He said it placed America not only in the lowest, but in the basest state of vassalage, because it demanded an unconditional submission in everything, or as the act expresses it, in all cases whatsoever. And again, this is the number one proposal that Hamilton made in the summer of 1787. And surprisingly enough, if you look through some of Hamilton's own writings in 1774, which I'll get to in a moment, he wasn't a fan of the British having this power either. Now, James Madison, in his report of 1800, mentions this as well. And he talks about how this was the ground of the revolution, the radical change in the viewpoint of the people that led to the War for Independence in 1775. And here's how Madison described it. "The assertion by Great Britain of a power to make laws for the other members of the empire in all cases whatsoever ended in the discovery that she had a right to make laws for them in no cases whatsoever." So basically pointing out that when a government tries to exercise unlimited power, that government may find out that the people don't want to be part of them anymore, and then they have no power over them whatsoever. He said, such being the ground of our revolution, he's pointing out that this is the foundation of the American Revolution, that radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760 through 1775. Now, it wasn't just Madison in 1800 or Paine writing after the fact. This was mentioned over and over and over in documents and speeches and the like throughout the Revolution. Here are a few examples. The Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress in October 1774. They start out, this is their first statement, references this as well. "Whereas, since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statutes in all cases whatsoever, hath in some acts expressly imposed taxes on them, and in others under various presences. No, I'm not sure of the context of that. But they're basically saying, look, the idea that we're opposing a tax, this is only an outgrowth of their claimed power over us in all cases whatsoever. Hamilton took the same position as well. I'll get to that in just a moment. Here again, in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This is Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson in July of 1775, just months after the shot heard round the world, pointing out, and this was passed unanimously in Congress as well, why they were taking up arms and fighting back. And they listed a number of things, a number of problems, but then pointed out this: but why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? By one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And so Dickinson, Jefferson, and the rest of the Continental Congress recognized that an unlimited power over them was something they had to draw a line in the sand against. They could not give up and give in. And it is also mentioned as one of the so-called grievances, the injuries or usurpations in the Declaration of Independence, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring them in cells invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Now, Alexander Hamilton, he was, we don't know the exact age, 17 or 19 years old, in December of 1774. This is just barely 2 months, not even 2 full months after that declaration of the First Continental Congress. And Hamilton is discussing this same thing, this declaratory act as well, about how terrible it is. And this is the subject of the controversy. He said, what then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? Is it just, some people are suggesting that there's this crazy conflict going on because of a small tax on tea. And many people are pointing out, Hancock did as well, and they also did at the beginning of that Declaration resolves in October of 1774, that, they're exercising this claimed authority over us in all cases whatsoever, this unlimited power. Some ways that they do that, for example, are this 3-pence tax on tea. And that's exactly what Hamilton is getting at here as well. He wasn't a fan, although just a few short years later, just over a decade later, suddenly he wanted that for the new general government in these United States. He said, what can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3-pence duty upon tea? He thought this was absurd. He said, the Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous, then, is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3-pence a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we contend. So here's a young Alexander Hamilton recognizing that there is a revolution brewing, a full-scale revolution, and eventually it was just months later that it became a war for independence because of this claimed power, this principle, this power against them in all cases whatsoever. Now, Thomas Jefferson years later recognized that this is exactly what Hamilton wanted when he was proposing this plan of government. He said he wished, this is a letter to George Washington, 1792, he wished the general government should have power to make laws binding the states in all cases whatsoever. Now, instead of getting this kind of unlimited federal supremacy, at least on paper, Hamilton didn't get exactly what he wanted on paper, but we did end up with a supremacy clause that was supposed to be kind of a middle ground, and it reads like this: this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So this is kind of a qualified federal supremacy. It's qualified in that it's totally supreme, no matter what the states have to say about it, if it's made in pursuance of the Constitution. And here from our overview page on the Supremacy Clause, nearly every American will tell you, though, that the Supremacy Clause means the federal government is absolutely supreme in all it does. And every one of them is wrong. Most people, if you ask them about the Supremacy Clause, they'd be, oh yeah, federal law is always supreme. You can see this over and over and over. If a state tries to do anything that's counter to the federal government, even if they just opt out, play hands off, you'll get tons of people telling you, and mind you, we get this constantly, year in and year out, day in and day out, all the time. Anytime people hear about this, you get tons of people telling you, but states can't do that because federal law is always supreme. So even though it's not that way on paper, even though Hamilton didn't get what he wanted on paper, in practice, whether it's through the ignorance of the people themselves, and it's, I think, mostly because of that. People are either ignorant of this or they like federal supremacy. In practice, it's played out exactly the way that Hamilton wanted it. Now, Sentinel, in his fifth anti-federalist paper, basically warned that this would happen. I'm not sure if Sentinel meant that it would be this way in practice, or he disagreed with the legal basis behind the Supremacy Clause, but this is how he put it. The words pursuant to the Constitution will be no restriction to the authority of Congress. And he absolutely nailed it, because this is what the people have ultimately allowed. Now, whether or not it's because it was written poorly or because the people are so corrupt and don't care, or they hate liberty, or the government-run education system has fed them with propaganda, the end result is it is so common for people to take the view that federal law is always supreme. No pursuance thereof, none of that, no qualifier, nothing. And if you really think about it, because most people also at the same time take the position that federal law is law until part of the federal government tells us that another part of the federal government made a mistake. So basically, no one has any say on this except the creator. The creators, the people of the several states, don't have any say. It's just the created, the entity, the government itself. So the only way to determine that a federal act is unconstitutional is to go to a federal court and have the federal court say, well, the other part of the federal government made a mistake and they shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. And really, a government that gets to do whatever it wants until it tells you that it made a mistake is so close to unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. I don't really see much of a difference at all. Here's how Thomas Jefferson described it in 1798. The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion, and not the Constitution, the measure of its powers. Now, Hamilton wanted the government's discretion to be the measure of its own powers, whether it was politically palatable, whether it felt like it wanted to do something. Basically, power in all cases, whatever. Here's how he put it: with power to pass all laws whatsoever. So they could do whatever they want, whenever they want, as long as they determined that it was within what they should be doing. And that really means that the Constitution means absolutely nothing. You don't really need anything else. So the number one thing that I think that Hamilton really wanted was unlimited federal supremacy. And even though he didn't get it on paper, it certainly is played out that way in practice. And it may not be exactly there, but we are really, really close when you consider the idea that we're living under the largest government in history. Now, the second one here is implied powers, and that is one of the ways that Hamilton helped build this kind of unlimited federal power reservoir was through this doctrine of implied powers. Now, during the ratification debates, he had a completely different approach on how you were going to read the Constitution. And here from Mike Meharry, even Hamilton took up the limited federal power banner, writing this in Federalist 32. The state governments, quote, would clearly retain all rights of sovereignty which they before had and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States. So the central government the general government, according to Hamilton, before ratification, was not going to have unlimited power. It was going to be very much limited by those things that were exclusively delegated. But Meharry points out that it didn't take Hamilton long to change his tune. Less than 3 years after the ratification of the Constitution, Hamilton discovered implied powers hidden in the Constitution to justify Congress chartering the first bank of the United States. So Hamilton wanted a national bank. We have another version of that national bank, much worse, today, and the basis for it was implied powers that he discovered a few years after ratification, after he said there wasn't going to be any applied powers. Opponents of the bank, Mike writes, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, argued that the lack of specific delegated authority barred Congress from chartering a bank. So they didn't see it, and I don't see it in there either. You don't see anything in the Constitution that authorizes them to do this, but Hamilton then made the case that, of course, well, there are other powers other than what's been delegated. Even though I told you in the New York Ratifying Convention that whatever is not expressly delegated to the federal head is reserved to the members. That's what he said in July of 1788. Suddenly now it's a different take. He said it is not denied. So this is just indisputable truth, according to Hamilton in 1791, that there are implied as well as express powers, and that the former are as effectually delegated as the latter. And for the sake of accuracy, it shall be mentioned that there is another class of powers which may be properly denominated resting powers. He's got all kinds of powers. Suddenly they're going to have all kinds of powers because he wanted them to be able to do things that they weren't authorized to do. Now, mind you, I mentioned this in Friday's episode as well, that even though New York, when they sent him to the Philadelphia Convention, they sent him with express instructions that he was not allowed to do anything beyond proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So the fact that he disregarded, now, of course, there's an argument to be made that he wasn't proposing anything. He was just talking about a plan. That was his take on this. And of course, people who want to violate the rules given to them always have a convenient excuse as to why they can get away with it, and they're not breaking the rules. And that's exactly what he did in the Philadelphia Convention as well. This is a guy who repeatedly throughout his career said one thing one day, and as soon as he wanted to accomplish something else, was willing to do. I guess there's probably a name for that, but I'm not sure what we're going to use on this show here today. But anyway, so we ended up with implied powers in order to get this national bank. Unfortunately, President Washington agreed and signed it into law. Now, Patrick Henry warned us during the Virginia ratifying convention that allowing them to exercise power by implication would basically give us unlimited power. The way he described it was we would end up with 10,000 implied powers. That was Patrick Henry's quote. This is basically unlimited power, and I covered this in an episode back in August of this year. It will be linked to in the show notes, and as I'm mentioning show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We publish a blog post. Alan Mosley organizes all the links and other platforms that we're on. And then I get that published a couple hours after the live stream is done. So you'll see that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty sometime this afternoon, along with all the other episodes we've done on a bunch of other awesome things. We'll be linking to the original source documents, a couple other episodes, and the like. And I don't have time because I've got some construction here at my apartment again today, some roof cleaning or gutter cleaning, I guess there was what they're doing. So I got to wrap this up a little quicker than normal today. So I'm not going to have a chance to do the live chat, but please do continue leaving comments here on the live stream or in the archive, smashing the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts. All that stuff can help trigger algorithms of the mainstream platforms that you watch or listen on and help us reach more people. So I really, really appreciate that. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So we've gotten through two things here. One, Hamilton wanted unlimited power. He didn't get it on paper, but in practice, the way that people have treated the central government in general has given it to us in practice anyways. Now, one of the ways to get unlimited power is to suddenly have implied powers. Patrick Henry warned us that allowing them implied powers meant we'd have 10,000 of them, and it's probably closer to 30,000 or more. So he even underestimated how bad it could get. And number three, another one of the ways that Hamilton helped give us this near or total unlimited federal power was by redefining words. And I think the most important one that he used was the word necessary. He redefined the meaning of the word necessary in his arguments in support of that national bank in 1791. Now, when the Constitution was ratified, the word necessary meant, well, necessary. But Hamilton didn't like that. Here's how he put it. It is essential to the being of the national government that so, mind you, he says the national government. He doesn't say federal government because his goal was a national one-size-fits-all. And if you listen to Friday's episode or watch that one, you'll see that he didn't even want states. He was very clear in saying the only reason he didn't really propose totally getting rid of them is because he recognized that would be a shock to the public. So he is like, how can we kind of get around these pesky states and create a one-size-fits-all national government while keeping them kind of in place? And he gave a whole proposal for how to do that. And so here he is talking about it again, even after ratification, even after he didn't get what he wanted, he still pushes for it anyways. And that's a real manipulator, some kind of a socio, I guess. It is essential to the being of the national government, Hamilton wrote, that so erroneous a conception of the meaning of the word necessary should be exploded. You got to absolutely smash the idea that the word necessary means necessary. It sounds like what we live under today, the idea It's so Orwellian. War is peace. I mean, the idea that you can just change what a word means in order to justify more government power is not something new. Hamilton was all about that. He said it is certain that neither the grammatical nor popular sense of the term requires that construction. According to both, necessary often means something other than necessary. He said, according to both, necessary often means no more than needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. I mean, I have never used the word necessary in that way. It's necessary for you to finish your homework doesn't mean, well, it'd be useful or helpful to do it. It's just not how people use it. So he's absolutely lying here. In that speech or in that paper, he actually used the word convenient or convenience almost a dozen times. So he was using this over and over and over. And then even though, well, Aaron Burr took care of him, I mean, not a lot of people were fans of Aaron Burr either. So even though that ended up going down, Hamilton's necessary means convenient stuck around. Of course, we had the First National Bank that led to much more. But Chief Justice John Marshall, some years later, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, he adopted in some places, word for word, the Hamiltonian approach, the Hamiltonian definition. James Madison criticized this in a letter to Spencer Roane in 1819 in September. We'll link to this in the show notes. He basically wrote, and I'll read it here in just a moment, he basically said that the Constitution, the people who were considering ratification, never would have supported ratification had this been the commonly understood use of the word necessary. If the people who are, especially if we're thinking about places like New York and Massachusetts, it was barely ratified. Same with Virginia, it was also very close. New York, very close. The idea that some people that were kind of on the margins there would have said no had they been told that the word necessary meant, well, just convenient to government power. I think it's hard to argue against James Madison there that they probably would have lost and we wouldn't have had the Constitution. So it was a matter of presenting one case beforehand, lying about it really, and then flipping the switch later when you wanted to twist things around to expand power. And that's basically what we get with the Hamiltonian system, and that's really how most politicians act today. Here's how Madison described it to Spencer Roane. Those who recollect, and still more, those who shared in what passed in the state conventions through which the people ratified the Constitution, with respect to the extent of the powers vested in Congress, cannot easily be persuaded that the avowal of such a rule would not have prevented its ratification. So the idea that you can read the necessary and proper clause as giving them power to do whatever's convenient to carrying out any of the other powers, it's not too hard, and Thomas Jefferson talked about this as well, it's not too hard to think about a government looking at everything as convenient. Now, this was, I covered this in some detail in another episode. Necessary is supposed to mean necessary. That will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So Hamilton's goal, to me, was unlimited centralized power. He went about it by making basically a plan of government in the Philadelphia Convention. They basically just discarded it almost immediately. So he ended up actually leaving the Philadelphia Convention and then came back a little bit later, and then really worked after ratification to get what he wanted. Now, during the ratification debates, he presented a story to the people who were on the fence about this in ways that they wanted to hear it. Now, the whiskey taxi did the same kind of thing. This is good for this reason, this is good for this reason, depending on who he's talking to. This is a real chameleon, a real political scammer. Richard Henry Lee once said that politics is the science of fraud, and politicians are the professors of that science. And I think there's no better example of that, at least from the founding generation, than Alexander Hamilton. So he wanted this unlimited power, but in many ways, after the fact, he didn't get it, so he pushed for it anyways. We threw implied powers and then changing the meaning of the word necessary to convenient. There's no way we would have had that system if he had been honest about it up front. Now, on the other hand, one thing that he didn't get was getting rid of the states. He, as I mentioned on Friday's episode, Hamilton basically fantasized. It sounded like that. He fantasized about getting rid of the states. He acknowledged that putting it out there to the public, in a formal proposal would be too much of a shock to the people, and there's no way that it would go down. But he still said he thought it was the way to go. So as an alternative to that, his plan called for a way to get rid of the states in practice, to basically get them to act as mere subdivisions of the central government. And here's from his plan, point number 10. All laws of the particular states contrary to the Constitution or laws of the United States to be utterly void. Now, again, if you compare this with what we got in the Supremacy Clause, it's the Constitution or any laws that are made in pursuance thereof. This is just any law. I mean, what's the point of having a Constitution if it says that the federal government can do whatever they want? And that's kind of the absurdity of it. And he said, and the better to prevent such laws being passed, so any laws contrary to the federal government, the governor or president of each state shall be appointed by the general government and shall have a negative upon the laws about to be passed in the state of which he is the governor or president. So basically, you make the governors of each state, who have a total veto power over the legislature of each state, dependent on their role on the general government, the federal government, the central government, whatever you call it. In this one, kind of a consolidated central government. And again, he did not get this. This was not how it played out. But in Federalist number 16, he kind of complained about it. In essence, I'm not sure if he's referencing this exactly, but Mike Meharry describes it like this. Hamilton cites objections to state legislatures playing a role in bringing federal measures into effect. In so doing, he unwittingly lays the foundation of state nullification. So he put it this way: if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. So Hamilton did not want the states to have any interest that could run counter to the federal government. And because of that, he recognized that if the federal government had to rely on the states to do stuff, then the states could just opt out. Now, if they were appointed by the general government, then there was no opportunity for that. So here he is kind of complaining about that in Federalist number 16. And Meharry sums it up like this: Hamilton got what he wanted in one sense. State legislatures have no say in approving or disapproving federal measures. The federal government acts directly on the American people. Now, of course, that's qualified. They're only authorized to do what they're authorized to do, but their acts don't directly rely on the state legislatures. Well, they're not supposed to, but they do in most situations. He said, but states still play a significant role in enforcing the government's will. While state legislatures do not approve federal measures directly, the federal government almost always depends on state resources and personnel to carry them into effect. By refusing to act, Mike writes, states have the power to defeat federal measures for all practical purposes. I covered this also in some detail in another episode a couple of years ago now. The Seeds of Nullification, a lesson from the Articles of Confederation, because this is really going back to that time as well. It's a really interesting article, or really interesting episode that I hope you'll check out as well. That will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So the overall picture from Alexander Hamilton is unlimited central power. He worked on trying to get that in a number of ways. His plan of government in Philadelphia, it got rejected. So then after ratification, he did the implied powers and necessary is now convenient. But then he also really didn't like the idea of states being able to make their own choices. And unfortunately for Alexander Hamilton, he didn't get that. Fortunately for us, that he didn't get that either, because it still gives us, in spite of all the horrible big government monster state garbage we live under, we still have a small opening to be able to pressure state and local governments into doing the right thing. And then even if they don't, when enough people take the right approach, we still have a path to liberty. Now, this is the kind of stuff we try to get out to more and more people every single day. And there's absolutely nothing that helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm rambling about that, I want to take a quick moment to say a very huge thank you to a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. I'm not able to cite everybody, but here's a few people here that I'm very grateful for your support. There's Terry in Connecticut. We got Tyranny is Bad in Connecticut as well. I love the pseudonyms sometimes. Brenda in North Carolina. Gene in Michigan, Edwin in Texas, and James in Wyoming. I appreciate all of you for putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is where you can join us for as little as $2 a month. There's also annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.